Hello class and welcome to today's lesson. In Chapter 11 we'll be discussing the ethics of punishment and corrections. When we think about punishment, we think about unpleasantness or pain, administered by one in a lawful authority in response to another's transgression of law or rules. So we have to ask ourselves, what is punishment? Why do we have it? Why do we need it? And is it regulated properly? Punishment has been dispersed throughout the ages, and we know that there have been a variety of punishments ranging from shaming through corporal punishments through the death penalty. But when we look at this in today's perspectives, we have to understand what is an appropriate form of punishment given the attitudes of current society. According to Leiser, 1986, there are 5 elements of punishment. One who conflicts or receives the punishment, one who inflicts some degree of harm on the other, the person who inflicts the punishment who is authorized to inflict it, the person being punished that has been judged for his or her crimes, punishment for the act or omission of an act related to a particular instance of crime. When we think about the use of treatment within the criminal justice system, we think about how treatment is used to try to promote some type of positive behavioral change. But treatment in its broader definition is anything used to induce behavioral change with the goal of eliminating dysfunctional or deviant behavior. The goal is to encourage productive and normal behavior patterns that are consistent and congruent with what society expects. Rules and guidelines according to Hirsch in 1976 in protection of people's individual liberties should promote treatment, should state very carefully when intervening in lives, should state when it is justified to intrude in someone's life, and should clearly state deterrence and rehabilitation efforts that should be considered. There are several rationales for correctional punishments, and corrections has many goals: retribution, reform, incapacitation, deterrence, and rehabilitation. One of the major criticisms of the criminal justice system is that it tends to be inconsistent in how it renders its punishments. It is moral to take away rights. Is it moral to take away rights? In terms of punishment, does everyone get the same punishment? Why or why not? Discussions regarding punishment often lead us to question why some people may receive harsh punishments while other people receive less harsh punishments. And we know there are many reasons for this pertaining to a person's criminal history, the involvement in the offense that they particularly were involved in, and how seriousness that offense was is going to dictate the level of punishment. But also we know that criminal justice outcomes vary depending on a variety of different factors. Overall, a small percentage of those who commit crimes are punished. And this does not always represent society as a whole. When we look at impoverished or poor individuals or minorities or powerless, in that they may be poor in that they don't have a lot of financial resources, outcomes for these groups may vary significantly when compared with their counterparts. When we look at punishment through the 1800s, criminals were treated as sinners. They were viewed as people who have been a detriment to society, and they were viewed as a loss to society. The positive school developed a treatment ethic. The idea was that all criminal acts are symptoms of an underlying pathology. Something caused their criminal behavior. So this leads to early explanations of why people committed crime, and the only one explanation of theory that explains why each and every person commits crime is rational choice theory. Rational choice meaning that they made a rational choice to commit their criminal act. Retribution is another type of punishment. And the punishment rationale really is that we want to get back at that person for the crime that they committed. So the punishment in and of itself is a means to an ends, and that it should balance the harm caused by society, by the individual. The harm caused to society by the individual, and society wanting to get retribution from the individual for what he or she had done to society. So when we look at retribution, we think about social contracts. So where social contracts provide the rationale for punishment, we punish people because we feel they deserve it. And Mackey in 1982 believed that there were three types of retribution. Negative retribution, which dictates that punishing people if not guilty. Positive retribution demands punishing if guilty. And permissive retribution, which allows that the guilty may be punished. Expiation is a form of retribution whereby one owes the guilt the benefit of the punishment in order that they atone for their crimes. Again, looking back at atoning for crime being related to sin, a person had to atone for their sin or atone to their crime, and that's why retribution was an important and considered to be a very relevant explanation for punishment at the time. Models of punishment. We have the justice model put forth by Fogel in the late 1970s, where punishment of an individual should be limited by the seriousness of the crime, although treatment could be offered oftentimes. The just desserts model was put forth by von Hirsch in 1985. And when you think about just desserts, you think about situations where punishment is purely meant for retribution. And an example of that would be if it was a boot camp type of situation and you had a juvenile who had committed some crimes within society and was sent off to boot camp and had to run 2 miles and drop down with a drill sergeant screaming at him and making him do push-ups. Society tends to want to see people get their just desserts, right? They committed a crime against society and now they have to pay. And so that's where this retribution model comes in, where you combine just desserts and prevention, which is why boot camps would be a good example. It's continued to be a persuasive rationale through the 1990s. Currently, the penal harm ideal focuses on aspects of the system intentionally inflicting pain on offenders during their imprisonment or punishment. They are merely depriving them of liberty, and this is not considered sufficiently painful. Now, when you think about incarceration, you think about people being put in a place where their freedom is taken away, where their liberties are to some extent taken away, and some may argue that the punishment isn't severe enough. It's not a physical punishment, it's a mental punishment. And so people are warehoused and they're separated from their families and they're unable to contribute to society. But this is meant to give people a lot of time to think about their actions, think about what they did wrong and how they can change for the better. But also it creates an environment where people who are a scourge on society and are committing serious acts against society are removed from society for society's benefit. If you look at punishment as prevention, so the rationale for this is that it's a means rather than an end, and it embraces any method that can avoid crime. So the idea is that deterrence, which in order for deterrence to happen, the punishment has to be swift, severe, and certain, meaning swift in that the person needs to be punished pretty quickly after the act has been committed, severe enough to where they don't want to do it again, and certain in that there must be certainty in that they are going to be caught. And that's why deterrence tends to not work well, is because most people don't believe that they'll be caught for their crimes, and therefore they don't believe that they'll have to suffer the consequences for those crimes. Rehabilitation, as we know, is investing in individuals through programs and services to try to change their attitude, change their behavior, give them new skill sets, give them new competencies so they can get out of prison and stay out of prison. And incapacitation is merely locking people up, keeping them away from society, and locking them in a facility where escape is not likely. So this is all intended to help to promote and spark a prevention effort to prevent future criminal activity. So you can really break deterrence down into two main areas: specific deterrence and general deterrence. And when you think about deterrence, if you think about that just as a blanket word, deterrence just means deterring people from committing future criminal acts. It does support retribution in that it's a supporting element of it, but it's not as focused on just getting back at the offender. So there are two types of deterrence. So specific is what is done to offenders to prevent them from committing future offenses, and general deterrence is what is done to an offender to prevent or otherwise deter the person from committing future offenses. Incapacitation, holding an offender to prevent further crime. Only hold an offender until there is no risk of further crime. So if you look at things like the sex offender registry or GPS monitoring or civil confinements of sex offenders following their term of incarceration or 3 strikes policies, these are all methods of holding a person accountable even after they've served their sentence, or in some cases a deterrent to incapacitation by using community-based corrections as a way to supervise offenders. When we think about treatment, we ask ourselves, what is the justification of treatment? Why do we try to treat individuals? Well, should the state really attempt to try to treat people? And should we force people into treatment? Well, the answer to that is that in order to garner parole, individuals have to show positive growth and change, and the only way they can really do that is through making positive investments in themselves. So through programs and services, they're offered opportunities. Whether they choose to take those opportunities or not are really up to them. But if you look at it from a sense of morally and legally, morally, I believe we do have an obligation to try to make the offenders better going out than they were coming in, and to teach pro-social behavior so that they can get out of prison and hopefully once and for all stay out of prison. There are a variety of different treatment endeavors that go on within prison walls. We have education, we have prison discipline, religious services, and there are different things like physical castration, drug therapy, neurosurgery, and people eventually will die even in prison if they're there long enough. Some believe that treatment is only effective if it's voluntary. Now, the way the criminal justice system tends to operate is we tend to force people into treatment. They may or not be willing participants initially, but hopefully they'll lower their walls, they'll lower their barriers, and they'll be less confrontational and be more apt to want to receive the treatment, seeing that it's an ends to a means for them to get released so that they can leave prison one day. But the results must support intervention no matter if it's voluntary or not. So there has to be some type of treatment, some type of program, some type of service that's offered for the betterment of the offenders. So we're back to our term of utilitarianism, where we use it to support the greater good concepts, and it's used to support deterrence, incapacitation, and treatment. Punishing or treating the offender will benefit society. So if you look at the greater good model, the treatment or the punishment, whichever it is, should outweigh the negative behavior on the offender. Ethical formalism supports a retribution philosophy. It's concerned with the consequences of the punishment and treatment. The criminal is owed punishment. So this, when you think about this in terms of ethically, if we didn't punish people for the things that they did wrong, would we really be doing them any justice? Because they're not learning anything. They're not learning a lesson. So we would not have respect of the person or for the person if we did not punish them according to ethical formalism. The ethics of care most likely support punishment, would support the offender to be a better person. The system does not take into account the needs of the offenders, oftentimes, under the ethics of care. Retribution and deterrence would not be supported by ethics of care either. So, retribution really is focused on again, getting back at the offender. And ethics, when you look at this ethically, we break this down a little further and we ask what's in the best interest of offenders? What's really going to overall help best shape them, help best posture them so that they can be productive members of society? And does punishment really serve that goal? Punishment, according to Rawls, is a loss of rights, and it should take place only when it's consistent with the best interest of the least advantaged. So there should be rules of punishment, according to Rawls. He believed that people must be punished only to the extent that the loss of liberty is limited, and that the loss of liberty must be justified as a minimum loss consistent with maintaining the same liberty among others. In the Eighth Amendment, which created the need for no cruel and unusual punishment, although its determination is somewhat vague in the court case of Furman versus Georgia in 1972, which was a death penalty case, it looked at, okay, what's really in the best interest of society? Is it unusual? Is it acceptable to the evolving society? Does it shock the conscience? Is it excessive or disproportionate? And is it necessary? If you look at punishment, you can also consider shaming as a form of punishment. And when we look at the impact of shame as punishment, we look at the stigmatizing form of shaming and the reintegrative form of shaming. So stigmatizing shaming is where the offender feels that the case is aside and abandoned by the community. And reintegration shaming is where certain types of punishment can lead to a reduction of recidivism as long as they do not involve banishment and they include healthy shame in the individual. So this basically states that when it comes to shaming, it should serve some greater purpose. If you look at punishment, you look at our most restrictive prison environments like Supermax prisons. This is very controversial punishment because you have people locked in their cells 23 out of 24 hours a day. They have very little human contact because that's strictly prohibited. Their cell lights are on 24/7. The inmates can only exercise for 1 hour, so they're allowed 1 hour out of their cell a day for recreation. And transfers were only reviewed on an annual basis, and transfers to Supermax disqualified them from parole consideration. So in Supermax prisons, they really make no pretense at rehabilitation. Their focus is on care, custody, and control to the extent where they need to keep these offenders locked down. They need to keep close eye on them, close watch on them to make sure that they aren't going to injure other inmates, injure staff, and or escape. Private prisons, if you look at private prisons, there are some ethical concerns here in that people who own and operate private prisons have a vested interest in keeping people incarcerated. So ethically, that's somewhat squeaky. You have the people who hold the keys to the incarceration of others who are profiting from that incarceration. So it leads us to ask the question, should there be profit made from incarcerating individuals? If they're in it for profit, are they really doing what we need prisons to do? So they hold about 7% of state prisoners, and they hold about 16% of federal prisoners. We have visited the topic of capital punishment. We know one of the main questions with capital punishment is, what if we got it wrong? What if we find that new evidence comes to light, new DNA evidence, and we find that we had taken a life that otherwise we had taken without reason? We took the life and we later found that we had it wrong. We had the wrong person. And it's too late to exonerate that person. So the main argument with capital punishment is it's irrevocable. Once we take that act of taking someone's life, we can't take it back. Public support declined for capital punishment during the 1960s. In 2008, 63% of Americans supported the death penalty. However, it dropped to 61% in 2011. And we know that we do have several death penalty states, and New York was a death penalty state up until approximately 2007, but it no longer is. So as public attitudes change regarding the death penalty and its use, then we're going to see more states either adopting the death penalty or choosing life in prison without the possibility of parole in lieu of the death penalty. So the number of death sentences is also decreasing. Exonerations are occurring more and more frequently. As far as capital punishment, some argue that it's not a deterrent to crime, and people that have very religious reasons that are not supportive of the death penalty feel that it's an inappropriate punishment. If you look at methods of execution through the years, they've changed dramatically from hanging to gassing to the electric chair, and now we commonly use lethal injection as our means of executing a death sentence. If you look at the correctional officer and the correctional officer's ethos or his code of ethics, his or her, you have this ethos that's developed by the American Correctional Association, or the ACA, and it really supports a code of ethics that focuses on professionalism, professional behavior, honesty and integrity, consistent and impartiality of the officer, assertive but not overly aggressive. They do confront bad behavior of individuals, but they also reinforce good behavior. They respect others, and they practice the golden rule. I hope all of you know what the golden rule is. It's simply do unto others as you would like them to do unto you. And the correctional officer should focus on teamwork, be willing to admit his or her mistakes, and not abuse their position, abuse their sick leave. There are some rules of the subculture of officers. They should always come to the aid of other officers. Don't rat out your fellow officer. Don't make other officers look bad in front of inmates. Support an officer in dispute with inmates. Support officers sanctioning inmates. Maintaining officer solidarity and showing positive concern for others. So again, this, even though this may not be a written rule, this is the subculture by which many correctional officers operate. So the beliefs of the subculture may not be shared by all. The pluralistic ignorance is the misperception of the popularity of a belief among a group because of the influence of a vocal minority. It's not a great deal of research. There hasn't been a lot of research done on this, but as far as the treatment of professionals, probation officers, parole officers, but it is something that needs to be looked at more closely. One thing you may find among probation and parole employees is you might find cynicism. And cynicism, you do hear people, when you think about the term cynicism, and it kind of describes pessimistic viewpoints. If you know anyone who's worked in the corrections realm, institutional corrections, you may hear them making some pessimistic comments about a view of human nature and the ability of inmates to change their behavior. There's also lethargy in that minimal work output. Sometimes when you're in a prison environment or in probation parole, you're kind of sitting around, you're waiting for something to happen. Oftentimes, probation and parole officers may feel underpaid and overworked. And as far as individualism, the unspoken rule that each one runs their own caseload is pretty much the way it works. You do work in a team concept at times, but you're ultimately responsible as a probation or parole officer to supervise your caseload, report on your caseload, and monitor the activities of your caseload. So you are very much an individual in that way. Okay, that concludes our discussion for Chapter 11. Please review this material prior to our class next Monday. Have a great weekend. Please feel free to contact me if you have any questions regarding this material.